or good evening. So, greetings, fellow WirfonCloud members. Um, I would like to welcome you to another session of the Cloud Practitioner sessions. We are dealing today with security in the AWS Cloud Part 2. Just to mention that we had Part 1 last week covering the same topic. It was an introduction. And for the benefit of those people who were not present, we would just go over a brief recap. So the elements here are just here to introduce what we're going to be doing. So we're just going to kick off, and hopefully with this recording, those who are not present will be able to join up later on. Okay, so whilst you're on here, please put your volumes on mute, and hopefully towards the end, there'll be a question and answer session, which we can freely have, which you can ask questions. Okay, so this was the agenda for part 1. So in part 1, for those of you who were here, you recall that what we did, we covered what was known as the AWS well-architected framework. It was just a brief overview of how AWS, the AWS cloud, how to design, build, and maintain an AWS cloud. So these are more or less tips or best practices in doing so. One of those things which helped us in actually understanding how to develop a well-architectured cloud was the security pillar. So as I mentioned, there were 5 pillars or 5 different best practices which we could focus on in building a well-designed cloud. Security was one of those. And we're actually looking at security today. And that is really based on what the AWS calls the shared responsibility model. So when we're talking about security, we defined what security was in a general sense. So for those of you who are not familiar with what security is, when we're talking about information technology, we actually looked at that, giving some basic definitions, and we tried to go through why it was important. The shared responsibility model was a means by which we could understand how security in the cloud was being delivered insofar as AWS was concerned. And we covered that that model itself meant that responsibilities into how we delivered this security feature was shared between AWS and us, who are the users or the client using services in the AWS cloud. I then covered and just briefly went through some security best practices in the AWS cloud. We looked at this from a very general point of view, but if those of you that can remember, last week we went through 7 different examples or elements which we could use to examine best practices in the AWS cloud. And from the very last point, we covered an element of our first part of network security, which was to deal with the virtual private cloud. As you know, what you have when you take on cloud services are delivered from a data center, right? So instead of owning your own data center, what you have is that you then hire those data center services from a cloud provider such as AWS. And then so we looked at what was involved in providing security from the first principles using the virtual private cloud as a first step. And then we examined things such as security groups and network access control lists. And we looked at things such as VPC flow logs. So those are the things that you would recall. So that was the agenda that we covered in part 1. So I'll just briefly look at this.
How do you go? Do you have to install? Excuse me, sir. I already installed it. The network is very.
Can you hear me?
No, the volume is very.
It's very low.
Okay, hang on.
How many other people have low volume? Just checking. Is everyone?
I think I have the same issue too.
Yeah, you can see the chat. Everybody are complaining about the volume.
Okay, strange. I don't know why it's okay for my end. Yeah, so.
Can anybody hear me now?
Yeah. I hope, please confirm if you can.
Yeah, I cannot see the chat at the moment. So can anybody hear me now? So if you just acknowledge whether it's yes or.
Yes, the volume is okay now.
Volume is better. Okay. I'm on a headset now.
Okay.
Okay. So shared responsibility model. You'll be familiar or you may have seen this diagram. So basically the shared responsibility model is a division of labor. So which is done by AWS. So the top section is what the customer is responsible for, and the bottom section is what AWS is responsible for. I will go a bit further and then just talk about this. So in summary, AWS is responsible for security of the cloud. What does that mean? So security of the cloud involves providing certain elements which AWS is responsible for the security. So that includes, first of all, the data center infrastructure. So those are things like the racks, the cages. If you know what a data center involves, it has all the cabling. That is the first element. It involves also to the servers and the storage. So that's the equipment that you have inside those data centers. You can see the server, and then on the bottom half here, you have a high a disk drive and a solid state drive, which is used for storage. The next element there involves the operating system. So AWS will provide you a base level of the operating system, either Linux or Windows, by which your servers will actually run on. So they'll make sure that the base operating system that they give you is one which is a secure version. It's a genuine version, right? Next element, the power, the uninterruptible power supply, the business, the building management system, everything that will make that data center secure. So I have a sprinkler system there to cut out fires. There's a power provision there. AWS will make sure that that element is provided. They are responsible for that. And then lastly, they'll provide to physical security of that building. That involves a CCTV, closed circuit television, that things like biometric scanners, hand readers of that nature, which they'll provide. Yeah. And the other elements which are within that is that any other equipment which is within that data center, which ensures the functioning of the data center, that would allow you to provision a VPC, is going to be covered by AWS. So AWS will make sure that all those things are redundant. Yeah. So this encompasses the security of the cloud. So when we go back to this, we see that shared responsibility model. That is the security of the cloud. AWS has responsibility for that. So we ask ourselves now, what are we responsible for? So security in the cloud now is a responsibility of us, we the users of this. So part of this involves the following things. But the main thing, I'll just summarize it, is by saying is that we're protecting our data and protecting our applications in the cloud using tools and processes is the responsibility of us. What does that mean? So it means managing our identities. Now, as part of this program of a cloud practitioner, you did identity and access management. We as the users are responsible for setting that up. So identity management is our responsibility, maintaining our standards. So the standards in which we keep data, how we maintain it, the risks, the compliance standards, those things are done, are our responsibility. Yes. Maintaining our secrets, how we keep data so that it is remains private, falls under encryption. It's a concept which you've already covered, right? Is a form of security. Monitoring what actually happens within your cloud environment, mm, which comes under detection of services, is something we're going to cover today. And then responding to what we find when we detect something which which is a security breach or a security hazard, falls under security remediation. Now that involves some much more elements, but that falls under what is called security remediation, mm, or security response. So that is what is known as security in the cloud, in a nutshell. So with that being said, now we can then move now to what we are going to do with today. So today we're going to look at this part two, which is of the agenda. So we're going to be looking at specifically security in the cloud. And that would mean we would look at AWS security and compliance services. These are the tools, and hopefully the processes that would help us actually manage our security, the security environment, which we have. We'll look at the security framework. Now we have all these services which are there. There must be a means by which we can actually bring all these services together, where we can have, let's say, a means by which we can structure the services in a way that makes sense. I will then cover some elements about some security terms, which you will encounter at some point, uh, on a general level. And hopefully at the end of it, we'll just have a small quiz just to help to remind us about what we've covered. Um, and since I hear that there may be an opportunity tomorrow for you to just have some revision and also to some testing, we might also cover some of that tomorrow as well. Okay. That being said, that's the agenda for part two, with a brief overview of what we did last week. So starting off now, so the AWS Security and Compliance Services being the first element of this. So basically, at a glance, this covers what is known as first, these first five topics. So we talk about infrastructure protection. Yeah, we'll talk about detection. We'll talk about data protection, and then lastly, there are two other elements, which is identity access management and incident response. Now, the last two elements are not going to cover them as part of this presentation. There's a good reason for that. Identity and access management, you've already covered, or you should have already covered. So I would then recommend that you go back to the elements which is talking about identity and access management. But just to let you know that that is very much a security element, which is very crucial and very important for us to get started and to make sure that we're responsible for that. Incident response is something which I will cover very briefly, but I'm not going to cover in a very general way, right? I've also included a URL link right here, which allows you, when I click on that, as you can see here, this is the security, identity, and compliance services of AWS. So when you see this, you can see that this gives you a brief summary of all the services, and you see that it has it listed categories, um, under identity and access management. So you see the whole list of AWS services which are there, and you see what it's for. So I would ask that you go to this link and you read up on this page. It gives you a very brief summary of what all the services which are there. Now, for those of you that are thinking about it, you may not need to know every single piece of these services. But what we're going to do during this presentation is that we're going to cover the most important elements. Okay, so that being said, let us start. So the first part of this is infrastructure protection. What are we talking about infrastructure? So infrastructure really is, we're talking about our virtual private cloud. So the virtual private cloud is similar to, let's say, having a virtual, a, a data center which is provisioned principally for yourself, right? So AWS has its data center and they provision parts of it. You can take parts of it to have your own virtual data center, and that is called a virtual private cloud, which you use. Now, that element itself, that concept needs to be protected. And with that, as I mentioned, we're protecting your VPC. And we mentioned something very important last week when we were talking about that, that in order to start looking at the services which you need to protect, you had to look at it first of all from a networking point of view. So from a networking point of view, we had these concepts which are known as subnets. So subnets is a means by which you can structure the entities which are inside your virtual private cloud. So you have a public and a private subnet, which I mentioned. So part of this is going through briefly what we did last week, but we're just revising it. And there are a number of things which we can use um, in order to monitor how traffic, network traffic, that is traffic which is coming into the VPC and is going out of the VPC, is actually monitored, right? So it's very important that we're actually able to secure our VPC by providing standards, mechanisms by which we can control what traffic comes in and what traffic goes out. Yes. And we can implement filtering or monitoring from the point of view using what is called a network access control list, yes, which is, or a NACL in short. And basically that is enforced using what is called an AWS network firewall. So a firewall is a device which is used for filtering traffic in and out of of a network. And a VPC is the concept of a network that when you are dealing with in the cloud. So inspecting and filtering traffic in and out of your VPC can also be achieved using your web application firewall. So there are a number of firewall provisions which are possible, as you'll find. Um, the other element of that is a concept known as the AWS Shield, which we're going to cover, right? So already you're seeing that from the infrastructure process, the web application firewall, AWS Shield, and the AWS network firewall are all structures or entities which can provide us with infrastructure protection because they help us to filter traffic which is coming in and out. Yes. Lastly, when we're actually trying to connect to our VPC, we can do that in two ways. Mm. You'll find this out when you deal with the networking services. You can actually connect to your VPC using what is called virtual private networks. That means you actually connect your VPC over the internet using a secure channel, which makes sure that you can then send traffic securely to and fro your VPC, or you can connect to that particular VPC from an external location by a private connection, which is called a direct connect. More on that later. So as you can see here, we covered this a bit last week. You can see here that the first part that we have is that we have this entity called the VPC here, which is our virtual private cloud, and we use our subnets. So we've got a private subnet, which is a private subnet is an entity, is a means by which we segment our network, which we divide our network. Like if you have a house, you've got different rooms. You know, when you have rooms, that kind of divides your house, your home, into different parts, right? So a private network is private to you. That means nobody from the external, from the internet can access that private network. The public network is as mentioned. When it's public, that means anybody from the the internet or outside of the AWS cloud can access it. Yes. And in order for you to get access to this provision, you have what I call networks access control list, and you have uh, also have a transit gateway. A transit gateway is one of the first portals that allows you to connect to either, as we mentioned, a private dedicated connection known as AWS Direct Connect, or a connection which you can use over the internet called a virtual private network. You see, so this diagram here summarizes how you can securely access your VPC from outside the AWS network. Moving forward, one of the elements which is important within your VPC is that your VPC will be connected to the outside world. One of the things you have to guard against is a threat known as the distributed denial of service attack. Now, what this is that you can have somebody here, an attacker, right, who is able to take over a number of machines, and he's able to then make demands to an application server. So an application server is a device which is within your VPC, and he's able to control these machines so that they make requests, or they are trying to access this application server. So basically, what you are trying to do is that this server here receives so many requests that it can handle. Let's say because most servers can only deal with so many different requests at any one particular time. Mm. So if at all there are so many requests that it can handle, this server will shut down because it becomes overwhelmed, because there's so many different computers asking it for a service. So what happens is that when a server shuts down, it is no longer accessible and it's no longer responsive. That is a denial of service. So when it shuts down, that application server or that server is no longer available. It cannot provide a service to the internet. It's a very, very common way which people use to actually shut down. So it's not a breach where people can enter your network, but they just simply stop people from doing business with you on the internet, right? So if you want to go onto Amazon, for example, people can just say that the Amazon.com, you can just block it by just provide overwhelming it. But Amazon has ways in order to counter that. Okay, so that is a threat which a lot of businesses in the world actually face. Now, how do they mitigate or counter that argument? They have some protection elements there. Now, there are two elements which are very common, which AWS does. AWS AWS Shield. So this element here, Shield, is a service which is available to all clients that have a VPC, right? Parts of it, you've got AWS Standard and AWS Advanced. So AWS Standard is a service which is free of charge, but that provides us with DDoS protection on AWS. You don't have to pay for this, but it provides you with protection. So it makes sure that nobody, that your web servers, your application servers cannot be overwhelmed. Now, if you want an extra layer of protection, you can go for the paid service, which is called AWS Shield Advance, right? So remember this name, that AWS Shield is associated with distributed denial of service protection. So the threat is distributed denial of service. So to get protection from that, you use AWS Shield. Okay. There are other elements as well which help you to control traffic within your network. You'll see them as CloudFront and Route 53. So this provides you protection of your networks in the further reaches of your network. But just remember that AWS Shield is the main provision that you have. So as you can see here again, AWS Shield is right at the edge. You see it here right at the edge where it's operating. So when somebody is coming in that would like to access, that wants to access your subnets, they would first come through what is called a Route 53. So Route 53 is your domain name service. So when somebody is trying to contact, let's say my website, my name is Akwo Fese. So let's say my name is akwofese.com. So the AWS Route 53 is what is called a resolver. So people it helps people know where my domain is hosted. So where Akwofese is hosted. So if I host it with AWS on AWS cloud, then that Route 53 works with that. Now, in conjunction with AWS Shield, I can protect my website, making sure that my website doesn't get inundated by so many requests. And you can see that that is also implemented later on, also inside of the network past my internet gateway. So you can see there's a defense against that DDoS attacks that may occur, right? So you can actually see the location now where AWS Shield is actually implemented. So before the internet gateway or to your VPC and inside your internet gateway. Okay. If you recall, one of the other elements which I talked about filtering. So filtering traffic in and out of your network. One of the ways in which this can be done is using what is called a web application firewall or a WAF. So a WAF is a type of device which actually provides protections against what is called SQL injections or cross-site scripting. You don't really need to know about too much of this in detail, but what a WAF does is that it protects your web server. So it's a web application. So it really protects your web applications. So and that is typically done at what is called layer 7. So when at some point we're going to do networking, which is a topic which I may be leading, or maybe one of my fellow colleagues will be leading with you, where you get to understand how networking actually works. But suffice to say, in that this WAF works with a number of different devices to deliver you some protection against exploits or threats which you would find on the internet. So those threats are SQL injection and CSS cyber threats. Very important element. So as you can see from before here, that web application firewall in conjunction with AWS Shield gives you an element which protects your web application server. Okay, all right. So we've dealt now with two devices now that provide you with infrastructure protection. The other element of this is called the AWS Firewall Manager. Now, this in itself is not a typical, is a typical service which embraces a number of things. So within this Firewall Manager, you use it right now to cover a number of security features, right? So it works at the level of AWS organization level. So you may have encountered that when you're dealing with one of the ways in which you can build your AWS services is using a term known as AWS organizations. It's just really an abstract, a way of organizing your assets into efficiently, right? But what AWS Firewall Manager does is that it allows you to set up different types of rules. So it involves the WAF we're talking about. It involves AWS Shield. It involves network firewall rules, and it involves Amazon Route 53 services. So from this one device here, you're able to manage all these different entities in one device. So this makes things that it ensures that you don't really forget anything which is of importance. So you can use AWS Firewall Manager in order to have control of your WAF, AWS Shield, AWS Amazon Route 53, and all other network firewall features. So when you deal with AWS Firewall Manager, it is a service that embraces all of these from one place. So it's a service that has many responsibilities. Yeah. So DDoS protection and filtering is provided by the AWS Firewall Manager. And as you can see from a summary point here, right? AWS Firewall Manager, you can see that we've covered AWS WAF, AWS Shield, Route 53, which is a domain resolver, and we have security groups. So that just shows you that within this AWS Firewall Manager, we can control all these 4 security assets from this one place. Okay, from a central point, we can manage and control the security features which are covered by these 4 entities. So a very powerful product, a very powerful tool for us to use. Right. That being said, so we've covered now the security element or the infrastructure elements of this. So next now we'll go to detection. Detection is all about actually providing
Okay, I think we lost Akwo there.
but you must be able to show that your network is actually safe. So what are the services that actually provide these detection elements, capabilities within our network? That's what we're going to cover now. And as a summary, right, there are a couple of those services that you're going to see. Yeah. So they would fall under a number of them. Now, for some of you, you may not be very familiar with what these things actually do. So when you're looking to find out whether when something is unauthorized, whereby there's an entity which is unauthorized within your network, and you want to check to make sure that you have somebody, you want to detect anybody who is unauthorized to monitor that person, you use what is called Amazon Guard Duty, right? It's a very intrusion detection services. For those of you who are familiar with um, with IT secure IT information technology security, you'll be familiar with the term called intrusion detection, right? So if you covered intrusion detection in IT services, it's exactly the same concept that happens in the cloud. But in the cloud, in the Amazon cloud, we have a dedicated service called Guard Duty that actually does that capability. There's another element of that which is known as vulnerability scanning. So you can scan your network. So it's just like shining a torch or a security light across all the elements of your VPC. Yes, but that really works at the instance layer. So your at your compute instance EC2, you can actually inspect your instance, right? Your machine, your virtual machine, to make sure that there are no vulnerabilities, and that is achieved using Amazon Inspector, right? And there's a means by which you can also do what, let us say, continuous monitoring of your resources. So, for example, you can decide to say that instead of checking for every single vulnerability scan, you can actually map out certain things which are very specific dangers which you have identified, which are relevant to you, right? You can have that stored in an area where you list the dangers that you're looking for, so that your system now can actually scan the network for those dangers that you know. That falls under a service called AWS Config, right? It provides continuous monitoring of AWS resources based on the level standards which you have defined. So people who work, let's say, in the banking industry, people that work, let's say, in the insurance industry or in the healthcare industry, you realize that you work in industries where there's a high level of regulation. You have to maintain certain standards, which you have to keep your information, right? AWS Config is going to be a very, very important service in maintaining standards of compliance and good governance. And lastly, if we want to monitor changes in our AWS network, if we want to have a record of what has happened within our AWS network, mm, what has changed, who did what did they do, how long were they there for, you have a service called AWS Cloud Trail. So it's a detection and monitoring service which is available for you free of charge, where you get to see what has happened in your network for over the last 90 days. So a very powerful tool that you'll have as part of your security detection services, in good time. So we'll just go in a bit further. So as we mentioned, the first of those that we're going to look at is AWS Guard Duty. So AWS Guard Duty is an intrusion detection service, uh, or a prevention service. So what it does is that it runs a piece of software, um, which allows it to detect whether there has been, whether anybody has accessed your network without permission. Yes, and it allows you to actually monitor the various parts, whether it's an S3 bucket, whether it's your actual VPC or a particular subnet, right? And when it does all this analysis, it goes and stores this uh, uh, information in a log. But what it does is that all the repositories of information which you have, so whether it's a VPC flow log, whether it's a CloudTrail event, as we mentioned, or a DNS query, it goes around inspecting all these logs, right, to ensure that there's been no intrusion or they can detect any kind of anomaly in it. That is what guard duty does. So it detects intruders, people who have been able to get through the front door. That's what intrusion detection does. Or you can say it's kind of like intrusion prevention. Prevent people who have come through the front door uh, from doing damage to your network. And how does it work? So as you can see here, uh, it takes logs from a number of areas. VPC flow logs is something that we spoke about last week. To guard duty. Guard duty inspects it. If it detects an anomaly, it can send an alert to other AWS services known as SNS or Lambda. But for the time being, just only focus on what guard duty does, is that it inspects all these logs, and when it detects something, it will send out an alert using CloudWatch to other AWS services. Right. So that's what guard duty does. It's an intrusion prevention service. So next element we're going to look at a Amazon Inspector. So Amazon Inspector is an element which inspects vulnerabilities in your EC2 instance. So when you have to say you're looking at, they ask you a question, how can you protect your EC2 instance? Always think about Amazon Inspector. It works specifically on your EC2 instance, right? So one of the things that you must know is that the rule is that the inspector agent must be installed on the operating system of the EC2 instance, right? you have to install it first. So there's no kind of like automatic protection that inspector provides. You have to take a piece of software and you install it on your EC2 instance, right? So that piece of software is known as an agent. So an Amazon Inspector agent, right? So the agent, when the agent is installed, then the agent is controlled by a systems manager, which is out, which queries the agent to look for vulnerabilities. So how does this work? Yeah, yeah. So that's what inspector does. We'll see. We'll come across a diagram to take a look at that. The third element which we're going to deal about this is CloudTrail, which I mentioned. Again, I said very briefly is that it's information which is current up to the last 90 days. Yes. And then information then can be transferred to different places. It can be transferred to Amazon S3. So what you find with CloudTrail is that it will take a log of all those things which have been happening in your network. So it's very good for providing governance, compliance, and auditing. Mm. So for people that haven't worked in very highly regulated industries, especially when it involves insurance, banking, financial services, healthcare, maybe defense, CloudTrail becomes a very important. So it's like a black box recorder. So when you have a plane, if a plane crashes, it has a black box where it records everything that has been happening to the plane's engine or the entire flight electronics. That's what CloudTrail does. It records everything that happens automatically. Okay. And I actually mentioned a use case there. So security audit teams, insurance auditors, inspectors can come and actually take information from CloudTrail, and it gives them a way of carrying out investigations or just general auditing services. I cover some of the benefits of what CloudTrail does. What kind of questions that it answers. Mm. So when you have, let's say, an API, an API is called an application programming interface. That is really a concept which allows AWS. An API is a gateway that allows AWS to contact services which are inside the AWS network, right? So the CloudTrail actually gives you an account, a log in which you can detect what was requested, when a call was made, what resources were acted upon, and where was the API coming from, the API request coming from. Again, I put another use case there as of why that's important. Okay. Next, I also talked about config. Again, you can see here how AWS config is actually delivered, what it actually entails. So I did talk about the fact that you can actually, if at all you want to monitor from very specific standards or very specific threats within your environment, you can store those those records within AWS config. So when at all when you want to scan your network will come to AWS. Sorry, when you want to scan your network for specific elements, it will come to AWS config, mm, and AWS config will then scan your various network elements uh, to make sure that they're all in compliance with the standards that you set, right? So this is a way of just setting a standard by which all different services within the AWS network must conform to. So you use AWS config. So as I mentioned there, it's not really strictly a security service, but it's used for compliance and auditing. When we are dealing with compliance and auditing is that you have a set standard. This is the standard of with the way business must operate. And then everything is compared to that standard. That is where AWS config comes in. And so that concludes the element about our detection services. And we're now moving now to data protection, right? So data protection now is another element of security, which looks about, which is there to say, okay, if we accept that we're going to have a security breach, that we are going to have unauthorized access onto our system, that in most cases is inevitable. It's even a guarantee that it will even happen at least once. Every company has experienced some kind of a security breach. How then can you protect what is most important to you? That is where we'll be covering that under data protection services. And as a brief overview of how to do this, I've just really summarized everything in this first page, right? You may have covered some element which is known as encryption, encryption of services. So that is going to be everything to do with encryption. Encryption is the means by which you can mask, you can hide, or it is a way of actually hiding your data in form of a coded language, right? So you put it in a form of a code whereby if somebody who is unauthorized or is not permitted to see that access that data, once they see that data, they see it in an unintelligible form. That is what encryption does. So you hear about things called the AES, Advanced Encryption Standards. These are things which are very much um, part of all the services which we encounter here under data protection services. So one of the first things that we're going to encounter is a security threat known as data loss prevention. Especially in law firms or in financial services firms, one of the things which law firms, legal firms, and banking firms are very, very worried about is that things like contract information or personal client information could leak to non-authorized parties. So they have things which they call data loss prevention, which is there in order to protect the data or the privacy of their systems. So that's a very much a specific function piece which AWS has a service called Amazon Macy. So when you hear of DLP, data loss prevention, mm, or data loss protection, yes, you think about Amazon Macy, and we'll cover it. When we're looking about cryptographic keys, we're talking about encryption. So we actually take our data. If our data is moving, let us say from one place to another, from in or out of the AWS network, or is within the AWS network itself, we can protect it by putting it in a form whereby it's unintelligible. So it's encrypted. We can use AWS key services in actually helping us manage that. There are other very much dedicated devices that provide encryption standards, which are known as the Cloud Hardware Security Module that looks at it. There are other elements which actually control as well how communication in and out of our network actually works. And that falls under the element which is known as certificates. So let's look at these things in more detail. So the first of them is called Amazon Macy, which I talked about was data loss prevention. The key thing about this service is that it prevents your data, your most sensitive information from actually falling into the wrong hands, right? It's a very, very much a service um, that protects your personal identifiable information, your PII, uh, from getting leaked. Mm. So if something like an electoral list, for example, or you want to say a list or a list of or you have, let's say, a health files which has personal information about the state of your health. These are things which, if you want to protect those type of files, or you want to have a file, you have a file about a particular contract that happens between two businesses, you want to protect that, you use Amazon Macy in order to protect those group of files. KMS, Key Management Service, right? Now, when you have data which is at rest, that is data which is stored in a certain repository, let's say with data which is in S3, for example, or data which is not moving, you can protect it using the service known as KMS. And KMS really is a system which delivers encryption. So it takes the data that you have, puts it in a form where it's in a coded language, uh, and it can only be decrypted. Uh, it only makes sense to people that have a key that can unlock that code so that the code can be read, right? So to everybody else, that code makes no sense unless they have a secure key. So the key management service is really the infrastructure that is required in providing the security elements that are used for encoding and unencoding, so encrypting and decrypting the data which is there. So that's what is covered under KMS. I talked about encryption levels, talked about advanced encryption standard 256. That's an element which
Apologies. I'm sure Akko will get back again. His connection seems to.
you can provide. Before that, we had AES 128, which was the highest, which was called a triple DES, digital encryption standard number 3. Okay. So remember, KMS is used to protect data at rest, and it's a form of encrypting your data. I then talk about other areas in which you can really see how this is done. You can integrate KMS with many other AWS services within this. So it's fully integrated with Amazon S3. It's integrated with Amazon relational database service, Amazon Redshift, Amazon Elastic Block Storage, right? So you can see here how its integration now actually provides a level of security. So any place where data is stored and data resides, you can use KMS in actually providing encryption. Okay. So the whole element is that the encryption keys which is used to secure that data is what AWS manages, right? So AWS manages the encryption keys for the customer. So they use KMS to do that. Now, if a client does not want to use KMS, doesn't want to use encryption keys in order to secure that service, there's another way they can do it. They can use what is called an HSM, a hardware security module. So if the customer does not want AWS to manage the encryption keys with its KMS service, it can decide to say that, okay, I want to manage that whole infrastructure myself, and they can use this cloud HSM, right? So as it goes, this cloud HSM means that the customer is responsible for providing their own encryption within the network. I mentioned some other things there. So before we talked about AES, Advanced Encryption Standard 256. Now with HSM, it provides a level of encryption which falls under the FIPS 140-2 level 3 compliance, right? Now that is something that may or may not come during an exam, but if ever you see this thing, FIPS 140-2 level 3 compliance, know that it's Cloud HSM they're talking about, right? So a Cloud HSM runs in your Amazon VPC. So it just, once it's put inside your Amazon VPC, it encrypts everything which is inside your Amazon VPC, right? So this is actually a piece of hardware which is put inside your, which is dedicated solely for the customer when you request it. Of course, it has an expense. It's not something which is free of charge.
Next element, we talk about certificate managers. Now, when we're talking about data moving, when data is moving, so before we're talking about data at rest. So when data is at rest, we talked about the KMS and the HSM for data at rest. How do we then protect data which is moving? So data in motion, so data moving from one place to another. You're able to achieve that using um, a, 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 um, a communications infrastructure, a communications network, um, which falls under what is known as the secure socket layer, or or the TLS certificates. So the secure socket layer is really just establishing a security channel, a channel between two parties that are communicating together, right? And when those two parties are communicating together, what they have to do is that they have to have a means by which they can, first of all, identify who they are, right? And the way they can identify who they are is they use what are called certificates. So a certificate is just like, let's say, it's like a badge, or it's like a national ID. That's kind of like an analogy. So if at all you want to communicate, I want to communicate with you, I can use a form of identification which you and I must be able to accept. Mm. We have to first of all acknowledge what identification is, and that falls under what is called certificates. So with certificate management right now, you establish, first of all, the means by which you're going to identify yourself. Once you've done so, then you can then start exchanging information in a secure way. So the whole infrastructure around that falls under the certificate management, those elements where you can exchange these certificates before you can start transmitting data between two places, right? And as I said, one of the things where it's fully integrated with elastic load balances, CloudFront, and with Amazon API gateways. So it's also fully integrated with other AWS services. And one thing that you find with these AWS services is that these are services which always are points in which data is always moving through. Amazon API gateway. When you hear of that Amazon service, you know that data is always transiting to and fro, in and out. CloudFront, data is always transiting in and out. Elastic load balancers, you hear of load balancers. Load balancers allows traffic to move in and out. Those are dedicated entities. Okay, so those are places where you want to have the ACM in place so that it allows data through in a protected environment. How does this actually manifest itself? So this is a service here. I've also put down a link where you can actually look at AWS Certificate Manager. It's a very important service which you find because you encounter that when you're talking about data, data is in two states. It's either still, it's either at rest in a place where it's not moving, untouched, or it is moving. Um, So it's either those two states. So ACM is the standard which you use for data which is in motion. Remember that. So data which is at rest, you would use Amazon KMS. Data which is moving, you use AWS Certificate Manager. Try and remember those. So with that being said, we can now look at the security framework. I appreciate that we've covered a number of services here, and it would take some time. You need to revise these things, go back again and see how all these things really fit together and so that they make sense. But one of the things that we have to try and think about in terms of securities is the framework. And I've summarized those things in this element here. So a security framework is a means by which we can build and understand how security is actually implemented. And it falls under these categories which are here. So as you can see, identity access management, something which you've covered before, it's all about finding who is who, and what they're allowed to do when they come in, when they're dealing with AWS services, right? There's the other element of monitoring, checking that your cloud is operating safely. Uh, so it is one thing to say that, okay, your your cloud is safe, but you also have to check that there's nobody there who is lurking in the background, who has got through your, let's say, your security gateway. Mm. Then you have detection, which is the ability for you to detect what is unusual behavior or any unusual activities. Because one thing which cyber threats can do is that people can masquerade as being uh, a legitimate user, but they can be up to no good. Data and infrastructure protection, making sure that there are no gaps for any non-authorized users. We have covered the data protection already. Then there's the incident response and remediation. These are the tools that will help you to deal with the threats you've identified. Now, to be very frank, the incident and response remediation is not something that we've covered in great detail. In fact, I've just mentioned it, but I've not covered it in any detail. I've not covered any services in this presentation regarding that. The reason for it is that it involves tools which are not at this time quite relevant for the cloud practitioner exam. Okay, that's why I didn't cover it. But you are welcome to go and read about the services. And when this link, which I've been put down here, would allow you to go and read more about that. Last 2 points, prevention. Um, as they say, there's a big saying that they talk about health, say prevention is better than cure, right? So rather than wait for something to happen, rather invite danger to yourself, the best thing to do is to try and prevent danger. So prevention is all about putting in standards and putting in certain things that would actually eliminate threats before they even arise. Okay, it's all comes under good governance. Um, if you want to get rid of corruption, you don't wait until people start doing corrupt practices. You put standards in place that will help prevent corruption. It's the same thing too in IT cybersecurity. Compliance. Compliance is all about standards. Mm. Now, everybody might have a base standard, but sometimes when you put standards, you can have standards which are different for different places. Like I mentioned, when you're looking at the legal profession, you're looking at the healthcare profession, or you're looking at the banking, financial services. All these people have industry specific standards that they need to conform to. So compliance is a very big element of that. So what you'd find is that when you're looking at security in the AWS cloud, you'd have to look at these from all these elements here. Some of these elements, especially the monitoring, the detection, and data protection, we've covered in detail. So these three here we've covered in detail, right? The identity access management you've already covered before, like 2 or 3 weeks before. And the other elements of prevention and compliance are also mentioned here. So please do check out this URL link to see about how this all fits in. But I'd also like to share with you what this actually means from a very much a way that you can help to understand security. And that comes with this. So this is a security framework. So what you end up finding is that you're trying to do one of these four things at any one time when you're dealing with a security problem. So part of it is that you're trying to prevent or to protect your system. Uh, and there are certain controls which you can do in order to prevent your system from being security vulnerable, or you can protect your system from vulnerabilities, right? There are a number of ways of doing that. Chief thing which you can do is that you can provide security training. Mm. Beyond security training, there are elements such as identity access management, which we talked about, which provides a level of protection. There are security groups, NACLs, there's DDoS protection, which is there. The next thing is that if at all you cannot prevent or protect your entity, you must be able to detect when you have a security breach. Mm. And in order to do detection, you must be continuously monitoring your system. So you must be able to see what is happening in your network. You must be able to prioritize what is important, any kind of activity which is important to you. And then you must be able to log all those elements in one place. That falls under detection. And there are a number of tools that can help you do that. You know, a security operations center, a security incident and event management system, an intrusion detection system, right? There are concepts such as what zero trust. So if you see a you see some behavior in your network which is unusual, zero trust, you just shut it down immediately. You have a sandbox. If you detect that something is happening which is not authorized or which is unusual, you can just put that, you can just contain that in activity within what is called a sandbox. So a sandbox is an area which is, you can allow certain things to happen in your network, but you just say that, okay, come into this sandbox, do your destructive element, but you're not going to go to any other sensitive parts of my network. And then we have our response. Once we've detected that something is wrong, how are we going to behave? How are we going to deal with it? It entails everything from investigating, all the investigative tools that we can do. When we're investigating, what kind of analysis are we doing? So it's talking about, you know, your what is called forensics. So investigative elements right now. You're holding a microscope about what is really going on. When you're dealing with you're responding, what is your communication strategy, right? What are the elements right now where you alert, let's say, the stakeholders to what is actually going on? And the last part is actually called remediation. Now, these are kind of like the steps right now where you're into recovery, and the steps where you can ensure that your business is actually moving forward, that your business is actually your business can survive. So that kind of like the business continuity elements, the disaster recovery. You have business continuity, disaster recovery. These are processes which are in place to ensure that your business is not adversely affected. So if you receive, let's say, a ransomware kind of situation where parts of your network is shut down by a malicious player, and they're asking for a ransom, they're asking for a fee before they give you access to it, right? You must have some business continuity or some disaster recovery plan in place that would allow your business to operate if such an event happens. Yes, remediation also looks about learning lessons. It's all about learning lessons about, okay, now that you've detected these things, these malicious things have happened, what have you learned and what can you do to prevent what has happened? So you find that you're always going, you know, from one cycle to the other. Once you go through remediation right now, you've learned, you take those lessons learned, you can then take steps to prevent it, and you go through the whole cycle over and over again. So that's what we have as a security framework: prevent, detect, respond, remediate. Always prevent, detect, you see. So, and at each step, you're doing something different. So with that being said, right now, I think we've more or less concluded everything that we have to say right now. We've got 15 minutes, and I'd just like to go through a small security quiz. But before I do that, I think permit me to just move forward, just to move slightly forward. I'll just recap what we've done before we do that security quiz. So what have we covered? We've covered the shared responsibility model. Understanding who is responsible for what in the AWS network. We covered the security best practices, which I've listed here. Principles of least privilege, providing security, automating security tasks, protecting data in transit and data at rest, which we covered here, responding to security events and incidents, which we also covered during this part in detail. We also talked about AWS network security from a VPC level, which we also reviewed as well too in this section, in part 1. 7 principles to secure your AWS network. Just emphasizing that again. Principles of least privilege. all of you remember this from IAM, right? You don't give anybody full access to all of your systems. You only give them access to what is necessary for them to get access to. Uh, that is a very important concept to have. Uh, and then you review all the other concepts here. So these are the 7 principles which are in place. In detail as to what services actually fall within those various elements. We looked at the security framework: detect, response, remediate, prevent. Um, those 4 steps which you can use to address any kind of security a breach within your network. And we've talked also too about some elements about, of some security terms which are there. So just to recap again about all the services that we covered today, we did Amazon Shield, which provides us with DDoS protection. We did the WAF, which provides us with firewall filtering. We did KMS, that provides us with protection of our data protection at rest. When our data is at rest, we use KMS, which AWS will manage for us. If we want to have data at rest, protect data at rest with encryption, where the customer wants to manage it themselves, they can use cloud HSM, right? If they want to look at intrusion prevention, find malicious behavior in their network, intrusion prevention or intrusion detection, they can use guard duty. If they have an EC2 instances where they want to check for vulnerabilities, again, you need to install an agent onto it. You need Inspector, Amazon Inspector. If you want to track changes which are happening in your network against standards which you have set, you use AWS config. If you want to protect personal identifiable information, or you want to protect certain sensitive documents uh, or certain sensitive interactions within your network, you can use Macy. And if you want to track what has been happening in your network using API calls, um, all the interactions between various users, where somebody went, what they did, and for how long they went, you have a cloud trail, which is there. So that's a summary of services. And with that, there's also a link there for you to just click on, which it shows you all the elements, as I mentioned there, all summarized in place. But I think the most important thing to say is that, sorry, let me come back to, let me go back to where I am. Okay. Oh, let me just go back to sharing this. Sorry. Yeah. So going back to where I am again, that's the recap. So we're into the last 10 minutes. So thank you for listening. I'll just also, there's a list of terms here which you'll find: distributed denial of service, data loss prevention, intrusion prevention, network firewalls, cloud-based firewalls. I'm not going to read all these things there. I mean, I'll send you'll have a copy of this presentation. You read this in your own time. But this is just kind of like a good elements for you to know. Things which I mentioned during the course of this presentation, which you can read up a little bit more in more detail, where I've described what these concepts are. So I'm conscious that not some of these concepts may not be fully familiar with some people, right? So with that being said, right now we can just go on to now a very brief a very brief quiz. So into the last 10 minutes. So some of you may recall when you were doing identity and access management training that using the concept of AAA, authentication, authorization, and accounting. So which component determines whether a user is allowed access to a resource? So if anybody can just come off mute and make a selection there, A, B, or C. So identity access management.
I have 4 people on chat. They say A. On chat, we have 4 A.
Okay. That is not correct. Can we try again?
I have 1B.
Okay. Let's try again.
3 Bs.
3 Bs. Okay. Authorization is the correct answer. B is correct. So it determines what a user is allowed to access, right? Authentication is just simply establishing your identity, establishing who you are. Authorization is establishing what you are allowed to do. Accounting is a record. Accounting just deals with the record of what you did. Okay. So it's important that we get to understand what these elements do. So when you are dealing with identity access management, it covers these 3 concepts. But when it involves knowing what you're allowed to access, it will be B. Okay. Let's look at another one here. An organization has recently been attacked by a hacker. The organization is looking for a means to find systems that do not comply with the organization's policies. That is operating systems, patch level security groups. So you can take organizations' policies to be like organization standards. What is the simplest method for the organization to find a systems that do not meet the organizational standards? Is it A, CloudWatch? Is it B, AWS CloudTrail? Is it C, AWS Config? Is it D, AWS CloudFront? Answers in the chat, please.
I have 1B and 1C. And there's 1D, there's 1C as well. So I have 2 Cs, 1B, 1D.
Okay. The people who said C are correct, AWS config. So remember that AWS config is suitable for, you recall that is suitable for compliance and standards. So if you have standards within your organization which you want to set up and you want to test the rest of the AWS system against those standards, AWS config is the right service to go with. Now, the one thing which was just a complete outlier here, the person that talked about the CloudFront, that will not fall. That would definitely not apply here because that is all about providing access to your resources, allowing your resources to be accessed more efficiently from with more efficiently in a very performant level from different parts of your network. CloudTrail is an element whereby you can record all the activity within your network. So the people that answered B, this is a recording. As I said, it's a black box. It records everything, the activities that has been happening in the last 90 days, and you can do it beyond. CloudWatch is a set of alarms, which you can use more or less to highlight certain activities that are of interest to you. So the correct answer here was config. So well done for the people that got that answer. And lastly, which of the following are customer responsibilities under the shared security model, shared responsibility model? So pick 3. So pick 3 items here which you believe for which are the responsibilities of the customer. That's not the responsibility of AWS to provide. Remember, there's a division of what AWS is responsible for, and there's an element which the customer is responsible for. So which 3 elements here are the responsibility of the customer? Pick 3. So you can do process of elimination. Which are the things there which the client is not responsible for, which AWS is responsible for? There are 2 of them.
I see there's DCA, there's BCE, there's ACG.
Okay. Okay.
2 ACGs,
Right.
1 BCE. Yeah,
Okay.
go ahead.
So out of the 5, right, there are 2 of them that are definitely that are AWS's responsibility. The first of them, I'll start with E, managing the underlying hardware of an EC2 instance. As I mentioned, infrastructure, the physical infrastructure is AWS's responsibility. So a customer will not be responsible for that under the shared security model. So E is immediately eliminated. And the other one which is there is C, patch management of the serverless operating system. So when we talk about serverless, it's a concept whereby AWS is actually providing infrastructure which people can rent from them. So it's a pay as you go kind of service. So the patch management of that serverless operating system is AWS's responsibility. So as we've eliminated C and E, therefore the things which the customer will be responsible for, as we mentioned, IAM credentials. We are responsible for that as a customer. We are responsible for providing security groups on our on our EC2 instances. We are responsible for that. ACLS, that stands for access control list, right? We are responsible for providing access control list. If you recall, we talked about the difference between a security group and an access control list, where they operate, right? So the correct answers here are option A, option B, and option D. Okay, right. So it's now six. We're up at the hour. We've now come to the end of our session. I'd like to thank you very much for your attention. I think this particular one I'll send out to the group later on. But I'd like to thank you very much for your attention this morning or this evening, and wish you all the best, a successful day ahead. And if there are any questions that have arisen from this, please do drop them on the link, and we'll run through them. I think what will happen is that tomorrow I'll aim to put some questions together which we can review. Okay. So thank you very much for your attention today, and we'll catch up again soon.
Okay. Yeah, okay.